experience of the population to 18 million people, very sexual in nature, what we call the alien abductions. 1.5% of the U.S. population has had, according to their own testimony, an alien abduction experience. Historian David Jacobs puts the number at 2% of the population. Jacobs is a famous but also infamous abduction researcher. He was a historian, taught history at the University of Temple. Lastly, a Lake professor known as Stuart Appel estimated that the number of alien abductions might be as high as 5 to 6% of the population. Now, Appel was a psychologist by training. Again, he is a very familiar name to those who do UFO research, so he was pretty close to the subject, spent a lot of time in it, and interviewed a lot of people. Now, if you just do the math, let's just go from 1.5% all the way up to 6%. You're talking about 4 to 18 million people in the United States alone, using a total population just to round off of 300 million. That's a lot of people. So the alien abduction syndrome is a lot more significant than we would think. When you actually do the math, the numbers are pretty high. Let's talk about the elements of the abduction narrative. What do alien abductees typically and routinely, repetitively say happens to them in this experience? Well, first there is, of course, the abduction. The abductee is rendered incapable of resisting by some means, usually unknown, and taken to an alien craft. Second, there's the examination of the abductee. And this is often, as I said before, very invasive and in some cases violent, very sexual in nature. But the examination trauma can extend to psychological issues as well. Third, there are the abductors. Now, there are several varieties of these in abductee testimony. Mostly they are small, gray-skinned beings with large heads, black eyes, small slit mouths, elongated fingers, maybe 3 or 4 fingers. That is a very typical description of who is doing the procedure. Next, there's the messaging. Abductors communicate with the abductees, we are told, telepathically. Abductees are told that they're special, they're chosen to help the aliens, help us, help the whole human race. After the procedure, after the messaging, there is the return. The abductees are returned to Earth, at least again that's the way the story is told, occasionally in a different location from where they were allegedly taken, or with new injuries, or disheveled clothing. Sometimes abductees are taken back to the same spot, but other times it's someplace new. Then there is a missing time element. Abductees frequently awake with no memory of the episode, and they often cannot account for the time that has passed during the episode, when they remember being conscious in a particular location, and when they sort of come to or realize where they are. Lastly, there is the aftermath. There's a positive and negative element to this. People who are traumatized with this type of experience often recover the memories later on. So they could be very normal, lead normal lives, be high functioning, and then for some reason they sort of recover or have flashbacks or something like this. They remember the experience. Oftentimes when that happens, people will seek out professional help, and they get hypnotically regressed, and they remember more and more details. Typically, that is a very negative experience. On the positive side, or at least to abductees, this is positive, the experience often becomes something mystical, something spiritual, like a divine encounter. Now, several mental and medical health professionals, again, have studied this phenomenon, devoted really a considerable amount of their careers to it. There's little to no psychological pathology in what they report when they study abductees. In other words, abductees tend to be very normal, just people from every part of life, every profession, every educational level. Very normal. Very, very little pathology is reported when people actually bother to study abductees. Historians, scientists, and theologians have discovered this as well. Again, very normal people who have this amazing, terrifying story to tell. You might imagine that people have proposed answers. What might be the explanation for this set of experiences and this narrative? Well, let's take a look at some possibilities. Demonization. Now, this is the explanation favored by many in the Christian community. There's some pretty obvious reasons for that, and we want to go through them. First, given a worldview that includes the reality of the demonic, again, we're talking about the Christian community here, the terrible trauma inflicted on people who experience what we call the alien abduction syndrome, that experience, is certainly going to be viewed as sinister. So this is kind of an understandable association that people would make with what happens to the victim, the person who's traumatized, and the details of it, connecting that to the demonic world. Secondly, the messaging that's associated with the abduction experience is also a pretty big deal. A lot of the content is opposed to Judeo-Christian doctrine, really biblical teaching. And if you actually read the abduction literature, no other religion really seems to be targeted, either the way or really at all, that Christian thinking is targeted by the messaging. This has been well chronicled by Bill Allner in his book, UFO Cults and the New Millennium. Allner has devoted a lot of his academic experience, his career to this area, and so that book is highly recommended. But the idea of non-human intelligences that may be sort of masquerading as ET and who are very sinister, who are not to be trusted, who have human harm as their intent, is not exclusively put forth by Christians. Now, the best example of this is John Keel's book, UFOs Operation Trojan Horse. Keel became famous for this book and his book on the Mothman, and he attributes very clearly a demonic, sinister backdrop to this whole thing related to alien abduction, and he will use those terms even as a non-Christian. Jacques Vallée is also noted for this in his book, The Messengers of Deception. He has other books that really relate to this whole idea. Vallée has become kind of noteworthy, again, outside the Christian community for being a person who looks at the data, looks at the messaging, and concludes that there's something evil, there's something sinister going on here. Now, he'll talk about the perpetrators of this occasionally in demonic terms, but he'll talk about sort of alien intelligences or interdimensional beings, that sort of thing. But again, to the Christian ear, this sounds very familiar. It sounds very demonic. Now, as far as specific examples of messaging elements that are contrary to Judeo-Christian thinking in the Bible, very quickly, you have the element of monism. This is the idea that all is one. Monism is a denial that there is a firm distinction between a creator and the creation. Everything is one. This makes sort of God either non-personal or part of the material world. It's very contrary to biblical thinking, but very common in abduction narratives and contactee narratives as well. There's a lot of moral relativism that goes into alien messaging. Reincarnation is a big theme. You might be thinking, well, didn't Christians, in years gone by in the early church teach that? They actually did not, and that's a good topic that we'll devote some attention to later in Fringe Pop. But that is not the case. And so for Christians who realize that, who sort of know the history of this discussion, when that element pops into the abduction narrative and the messaging, the flags go up right away. There's also the notion of personal godhood that's involved in alien messaging, that we really, we humans really are God in some sense. We're divine. We have this innate divinity about us. So that's going to be a theological red flag. And along with that, there's an idea of human divinization, that we are sort of on the path to becoming gods. Really in sort of the sense that we're going to be beings that, get to live out in space and populate our own worlds and that sort of thing. We're going to be like them. We're going to be like the alien creature that we think is abducting us. Those are all, again, message elements that really drive a lot of people, especially in the Christian community, toward a demonic explanation. But there's actually another reason why the demonization view sort of gets a lot of momentum, and that is if you actually look at the abduction accounts and go through the literature, go through the witness testimony, they have a number of specific points of overlap, especially the sexual elements, with accounts of incubus and succubus in medieval literature. These are demons that allegedly had sexual contact with humans. The compendium for this sort of material in, again, the late Middle Ages, the Renaissance era, is the Malleus Maleficarum, 1487. If you read any of that, you're going to see very obvious points of overlap between what people describe in those experiences and alien abduction.